gardens. And so if you're looking up, wanting to know what I'm talking about, where my resources came from, you're going to find them on that list of publications. You can get the publications, you can print them off or read them online for free. So feel free to look at any of our publications. They cover lots and lots of topics. Plus, you've got people at the booth behind us that they're Ask a Master Gardener. So they're master gardeners who can answer questions that you might have about your own specific circumstances. You also got some information about some upcoming plant clinics. We do Ask a Master Gardener online. We have DIG, which is desert gardening classes that we do both in person down at the extension office as well as online. So we've got a lot of education, and that's what we're here to do. So today I'm going to talk about spring herb gardens, but you really can take this into any time of the year. But it's a great time to get planting. I mean, I wore shorts for the first time. I hope my legs aren't too white, but I was outside today for a little bit this morning, and I'm like, it's warm outside. It's 80 degrees and it's like warm and everything's blooming. How many have wildflowers blooming in your neighborhood or your yard? Yeah, they're coming up everywhere. So now is the time to get excited about growing things. We say that the last chance of frost is usually around Valentine's Day, so I think we could probably safely say we're done with frost and it's a good time to get started. So who are Master Gardeners? We are volunteers. I'm up here as a volunteer. I don't get paid to do this. I talk at home and garden shows. I do other kinds of like gardening clubs and things like that. We also do continuing education hours so that we stay informed on what's coming up and what changes have been made so that we can become good informed educators for all of you. We're also called citizen scientists because we're learning as we go along as well, and that we are doing the kinds of things that you're doing at home as well. We do take a lot of hours and to get to this degree, and that we get recertified every year. So if you want to become a Master Gardener, there is courses through the University of Arizona, both for a Master Gardener as well as a home gardener, and you can find all that on our website. All right, let's talk about herbs. So why grow herbs? Why do you grow herbs?
In Illinois, I used to have a kitchen herb garden right out my back door. I picked them up and put them in my cooking.
So she used to have a kitchen herb garden, and she just picked them when she needed them and just cook with them. It's convenient, isn't it? It's so convenient to have them. How about cost? You know, when you buy, let's say you need a little bit of basil, and you only usually need less than what you buy at the store, right? And then you've got that basil that sometimes just goes bad in your refrigerator and you're throwing away, but you just spent $4 and you needed 3 or 4 leaves, right? So what if you had your own basil plant in your yard that gets as big as, I don't know, it can get as big as this table, half of this table. They can get really large, and then you have basil for days, and you can make pesto and do all kinds of fun things with it. So it really is more economical to grow your own. It's really not too hard, and I think it's fun. And I think you're right. The fun for me is going out to my garden and picking what I need and bringing it in and cooking with it. So I'm going to give you lots of ideas. So there's a lot of pictures on here because I want to get you inspired to try some things on your own. So here are some ideas on different kinds of containers that you can use. We're going to talk eventually about watering and plant and soil and what do you grow when. So all those things will come up in a bit, but I'd like to get you kind of excited about it. So you can pretty much grow herbs in just about anything. The nice thing about most herb plants is that they're not really huge. They're not like, unless your basil or your rosemary might get to be shrub size, but most of the other ones are smaller and have smaller root mass, so they don't need a lot of soil to grow. So you can grow them in fun things like this. Here is what we call a strawberry pot, right? But look, they've made it into an herb garden. Just tuck those herb plants right into the little openings. There's a raised bed. Those are, I think someone said they're selling those in the big box stores now, so you can actually find those anywhere. You used to have a friend make them, but now you can find them anywhere. Just about online, you can find any kind of a garden bed these days. But what about doing something in the ground? What about taking like an old wheel like that and making it something in a focal point in your yard? So that they've got a different set of herbs in each of the spokes of the wheel. You know, if you're into that kind of a look in your property and you like that, might be an idea. or simply using the area that's right there next to your garden wall. Or, what I like about this one is that this garden, it's probably looks like some sage here, maybe some lavender here, rosemary, because with things like our rosemary and such, we'll get really big. Our rosemary, have you ever, anybody here grow rosemary? It can get big, can't it? I have a rosemary bush that is probably 3 feet by 4 feet. And it's a landscape plant, so I don't put it in a garden bed. I recommend if you're going to grow rosemary, find a spot in your landscape, maybe along the edge of your property that you have a drip system to, and grow it there, because it will get really big and shrubby and woody. But you can use it in so many things, even in flower arrangements in the house, or tie it up and hang it in the shower, because that rosemary is almost like a eucalyptus smell. It has that really pungent smell, and it's really great to open up your airways. So there's so many ways to think about using herbs. We don't have to always grow them in a garden box. What about mixing them in with your vegetable garden? How many of you are vegetable garden growers? Probably most of us who do vegetables sometimes throw our herbs right in there, and there's no problem with that. They can commingle with that, so it's really good. In fact, they say tomato and basil grown together, not only eaten together are good, but grown together are good for each other. They're called companion plants. Sometimes certain plants will detract certain bugs from things. So our tomatoes can get tomato horned worm. I always have a hard word that. The big worm, if you've seen it, it's a caterpillar, probably about the size of my index finger, and it's got a hook on its head, and that's why they call it horned worm, and it actually will devour and eat all the leaves off the plants. But it is the caterpillar that turns into the sphinx moth, which is a beautiful moth that's probably that big, and is beneficial to our environment. It actually helps pollinate things. So we don't like it in our garden because it eats up our plants, but on the other hand, when it makes a cocoon and turns into a moth, the moth is beneficial. So it's all the balance in nature. So you could also put your herbs in with your vegetable garden. So really just about almost anything will do. The big key about it is that you want to make sure they get enough sunlight and enough moisture, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So you can get as clever as you want, and depending on how long you want something to live. This is really cute with the cups and the herbs in them, but do they have enough drainage? Are they getting enough sunlight? Those kind of things. So when you get fancy and do those kind of things, you just have to know that you've got it maybe by a sunny window. When you had yours in a little window box by the kitchen, you may have got a lot of sunshine. Patios. People say, well, I live in an apartment and I want to grow on a patio. Sure, if your patio gets 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, yes. But if if it's shady the whole time, your herbs are going to struggle. So just like our other vegetable garden plants, they'll struggle. I'm not going to be able to hear you. If you want a question, you'll need to come a little closer. She said, do they need direct sunlight or just bright sunlight? Bright sunlight will do. They don't need to have direct sunlight. As a matter of fact, when we think about growing in the desert, we want to make sure that they get some afternoon shade here because of our summers, right? So bright sunlight doesn't have to always be direct. One of the ways you can tell on any plants if it's not getting enough sunlight is if they get leggy. That means, do they grow real spindly looking? Like, is it growing really tall and maybe not putting out a lot of leaves? And it's because it's reaching for the sun and it's not growing the leaves. And in herbs, it's the leaves that we want to eat, right? Most often, that's what we're eating. So you can sometimes tell if something's not doing too well, if it's just kind of growing too spindly as well. So let's move on. I'll get back to some of this about sunlight and where to plant in a second, but I want to get on to what I have in order here so I don't forget anything. So most people say, well, how long will my herbs live? Well, it really depends. Some of our herbs will live for many seasons and some are just for one season. One of the things I would suggest is that you often observe your plant, because the book's going to say one thing and then what really happens in your garden is another thing. And basil is one of those. This says that basil is an annual plant. In many parts of Arizona, it is. It's going to die back completely in Flagstaff and probably Prescott and those areas in the on the rim, because it gets too cold. But here, in the more temperate areas, especially where I live in near downtown Phoenix, is that it's really warm, and my basil has actually survived several winters. If it gets frostbitten, nope, it's not going to be able to make it, right? So there's a lot of different conditions that might dictate whether or not something is going to be a true annual or not. Observation of what happens in your own garden is always the best thing to look for. So these are just some of the plants. It's not an exhaustive list. We've got plants, we've got some planting calendars in the back that might give you some ideas of what to plant when and how long they'll last. So I'm just trying to give you some education here on terms. The other term is biannual, which means something will last about 2 years. So parsley, curly parsley, and clary sage are two of those that will actually last a couple years. Another thing that's a biannual that is not listed here, but it's more of a flower, I guess, would be something like a hollyhock. It's a flower that takes 2 years to actually sometimes send up their spike. They kind of grow their leaves, and then they might send up their flower. So there are certain plants that just take a little while to kind of get that oomph going. And then we have our perennials. When I teach people the annual, biannual, and perennial, I say always think of perennial as permanent. Now, nothing is permanent, we know that. Even our trees, they might live 30 years, but they're not permanent. But if it helps you kind of have that kind of little tip in your mind to remember, a perennial is something that lasts on an ongoing basis. How many of you ever grown mint and wish you never did? Right? Because mint is one of those perennials that lives forever. Mint sends out its runners underground, and when it feels like it, it comes back up. So mint spreads easily throughout a garden bed. So when we plant mint, and I'll talk about that again, I'll mention this again, you want to plant mint in a container so that it doesn't spread and take over everything else, because it can overrun your garden bed. But some of these herbs here are more perennial. Now, even though garlic's on here, we grow garlic for the bulb, don't we? So garlic chives, yes, are probably are perennials. They come up year after year after year. But garlic, like an onion, we grow for the bulb. So the true garlic that we grow for the bulb itself, you pull those out, and then you can start another one by just taking one of those pieces of that garlic head, the cloves, and planting it again. It's really easy to plant. And we'll talk, again, I'll talk more. So when do you plant? This is not an exhaustive list. This gives you just an idea. We do have two different distinctive planting times for herbs. Not every herb is going to grow in every time of every season of the year. Quite often, we need to have enough warmth in our soil and enough warmth in the ambient temperature in order to actually grow an herb, just like a flower or a vegetable. So this is a small list of what can grow when. Now, anything with an asterisk can actually grow through both seasons. So you want to plant these, and you can plant these by seed or by transplant. So I know for sure that cilantro is one of those herbs that definitely goes through, you can plant it through, it's probably a little bit late to plant, because now that it's getting warm, cilantro is going to go to seed. And when I say go to seed, what happens with something like a cilantro, which is, a leafy green, so that's leafy. And what happens is it starts to send up a spike. And it starts to get this tall flower spike. And then gets the flower head. And then the birds, the bees, the butterflies, everybody loves that, including the nymphs of the ladybugs. They host on that. And then that's flower goes to seed. Anybody know what the seed of the cilantro plant is called? Coriander. Yeah, she's like, oh. So if you grow cilantro and let it go to seed, you now have coriander that you can use. You can take the seeds and just grind them up with a, any kind of grinder, electronic or hand grinder or what have you. Or you can save those seeds and plant them again. I love to save seeds for things that go to flower, because then what I have found is that they are the ones that come up really readily in my own garden, because guess what? They've already done one season in my garden. They just kind of know, they know the, I don't know how they imprint on that, but they know the soil, the air, the temperature, the whole thing. So think about that. When things go to seed, you might want to save a few of those as they dry out and put them in a piece of brown paper bag and save them. I'm not going to hear your question. If you have a question, come on up. Thank you.
After they flower, are they still good to use? Cilantro.
Oh, great question. And that's a good question for all herbs. She said, after they flower, are they still good to use? Quite often, what happens is when an herb goes to seed and starts to send up its flower, it's used all of its energy to do that. And what we find is that the essential oils and such that are in the leaves of those herbs are diminished. So they're not as flavorful. They might get bitter. So you can test it and see. Basil is another one to think about that. If you've grown basil, often our basil goes to flower quite easily. And they say just keep deadheading it, cutting it off. Even though the bees, again, we want to encourage bees, but that you'll see that your leaves on the basil will get a little bit yellow, really light green, and they just don't taste as basil-y, do they? They're not as fragrant, they're not as tasty. So the great question, thank you for asking. So there are other things you can actually put in the ground now. February, March, April, even into early May, but it starts getting pretty warm here in May already, doesn't it? So you want to give those plants a little head start before it gets too warm. So basil is a great thing to put in the ground as soon as the frost's done. And you can see a lot of what's ready either by looking at online at our publications for our planting guide, or getting one back there. We have laminated ones you can take right into your garden. Or if you go into the nursery or a big box store and they're starting to sell them, sometimes that's a good clue, but not always, because the people who do the buying for the big box stores may be out of California or someplace else where it doesn't get quite so hot here so fast. And so they may or may not have exactly what you need. So it's always good to know what should be planted and when. And people say, well, can they be planted by seed, or should they be done by transplant? That's sometimes a personal preference. I have found that cilantro does better when planted by seed. And the seed, it's kind of a hard seed, so it takes a little while for that little guy to come up. But I find the cilantro is much more hardier than transplanting it from a transplant. That's my personal experience. Basil, I've done both ways. It's been fine. You can root basil from just stems. So like if you have to buy basil from the store, don't throw away what you don't need. Take off the bottom leaves, put that stem into some water, jar of water, and you can root it, and then you should be able to transplant it. So a lot of our herbs we can do that with too. So where do we want to plant these things? We talked about the different places: containers, garden, with vegetables, in the landscape, etc. Well, here's the couple things we just talked about this too. You want to get 6 to 8 hours of light a day, okay? Direct in this, if you're east facing, or in the winter, some shade in the afternoon in the summertime. And of course you want that bright light. So if you have a patio, you want to put it on the edge of the patio so it's not right underneath the roof, so it gets the bright light. It could be that the sunlight comes through the area, right? It passes over the plants, but it doesn't linger there, so that's okay. Again, it's bright, just not heavily shaded. You want to make sure it's near a water source. And I know that sounds like, oh, well, of course, we live in Arizona. But I know myself, when I first started gardening, I tucked my garden bed away where I wouldn't see it because I didn't think it was going to be something attractive. I now have a whole different aspect. I have a vegetable garden bed in my front yard, so I think it's part of my landscape. But when I put it in the back, it wasn't near a water source, and I had to drag the hose across the yard. And do you think I watered as often as I should have? No. So now mine is on an automatic drip system, because that way I don't have to worry about remembering or What if I'm gone or I don't take a trip or what have you? It's being watered on a regular basis. And you don't have to have a sophisticated irrigation system. You can actually buy timers that go on the hose bib that come out the house. Put a couple batteries in the timer, 40, 50 bucks. Set it, has frequency, date, time of day, how many days, just like you would an automatic timer you might invest more money in, and you could hook a system right up to that. So there's a lot of alternatives these days that you don't have to put a lot of high-end investment, especially if you're somewhere where you're renting. The other thing to look for, and this picture depicts that, is that our sun is different at different times of the year, right? So in the summertime, our sun is more overhead, right? And in the wintertime, it's more south. And so in the wintertime, you're going to get sun that comes under trees and bushes. And in the summertime, they might be high. And it might be filtered by the sun and by the leaves of the tree. So you have to look at your own property and make those observations. And I suggest to people that they observe at different times of the year. Of course, we just passed, not just, but we did pass the winter solstice, and then we have the summer one coming up. But pay attention to that. And before you do anything that would be high-end expensive, like putting in a permanent garden bed, you might want to take a look at what happens in the summertime especially. But also know that what's sunny in the summer might be shady in the winter. So, you've got to just know where you're going with where you're planting. People often ask, what kind of soil should I use? What kind of dirt should I use? Well, we don't call it dirt. Dirt is what's out in the desert. Soil is what we use in our gardens. You can find lots of great soil mixes at the big box stores. So today, you can find probably 4 or 5 different ones, and they all kind of tell you what it's used for. Some will say container gardens, some will say garden beds, some will say square foot garden soil. So depending on what you're going to use, if you're going to use a pot or a container somewhere, look for container soil. It's going to have all the right amendments in it so that it's well draining. And that's the big key on a container soil, that you want it to be well draining while still keeping good moisture, but not too much. So we want that, and we also want to make sure that we have good drainage at the bottom. Quite often people will say, oh, I have this lovely pot, I want to put my vegetables or my herbs in, but it doesn't have drainage, what should I do? Well, you can still use it, and some of us will put a layer of rock down there at the bottom, but just know that that's not a guarantee that that's still not going to hold a lot of water. Drainage is, even though we're in the desert and we need to have things moist, we still want the drainage in the pot, because overwatering is often more an issue than underwatering. Because people think, oh, it feels dry. It feels dry to me, so I think I'm going to water it. One of the best investments I think you can buy is yourself a moisture meter. I don't know, do we have one of those handheld moisture meters back here? Not today. You can find them anywhere, but they have a long wand on them, just like a meat thermometer would, and so they can get much deeper than your finger can in the soil. Quite often I used to just go around and poke my finger in the garden soil or a pot or even a house plant and think that was enough. And then when I learned that I was probably not getting it down deep enough, when I had a pot that was good 12 inches deep, that soil on the top dries out. That first inch dries out really easy because of wind and sun and all of that. But the water, the moisture below where the roots are, is perfectly fine. So you can overwater because you don't know that the soil below, right where the roots are growing, is already moist enough. So a moisture meter is a really good thing to have. And what about fertilizer? People often ask, do I need to fertilize my herb gardens? Well, you might. They're like, great, Doreen, thanks, you might. Well, here's a couple reasons why. If it's in a container, yes. Think about a container as a self-contained pot, right? There is no other nature coming into this pot. All that your plant's getting is living within the walls of this container. And so that's usually what you use as a soil, which often has little green pellets you might see. Those are fertilizer pellets. But that stuff gets used up over time. And as we pour water into our container, our water even the water that comes out of your house has chemicals in it, because the same water that comes out of your hose outside is the same water you're drinking inside, unless you've done some kind of fancy setup. So we've got all those chemicals that have been put in there to make it safe for us to drink. And there are minerals kind of leach out into the soil. Have you ever seen like a white crust around your pot, or the white crust on top of the soil? Those are just the minerals from the water. We call those salts sometimes, not necessarily like table salt, but they are things that can be hard on our containers and hard on the plants in the containers over time. So you need to put some vitamins, if you will, some fertilizers back into that soil. Now, if you have an in-garden bed, you have the benefit of Mother Nature all the way around that garden. You've got whatever good things are going on, the little roly-polies that are living in there, the leaf litter that's decayed. It's all helping to create a wonderful symbiotic relationship and all these great elements in our soil alone. And so that sometimes is helpful to our in-ground garden beds and don't need to provide as much fertilizer. Now, fertilizer is going to make things grow. So you do want to make sure you're getting a good fertilizer. Use about half the rate for your herbs, because we don't want to have them grow too fast. We want them to grow at the right pace, but we want them to be able to have the nutrients that they need. So she was asking, she said, I've heard we can use things like banana peels and eggshells, coffee grounds. You can. So there's a lot of hacks out there that I don't know how well they work. I just tried the banana peel one out. I soaked them and kept putting them in a jar of water, and that's potassium. That's like pure potassium, right? We eat it for potassium, and our plants get it for potassium. I don't know that my plants look any better or worse for using it. So eggshells provide calcium, they say. I don't know that I've seen them in and of themselves have a direct impact. But all of those things could be put into a compost pile. And compost, do you all know what compost is? Compost is the breakdown of kitchen materials and yard materials, so grass and leaves and things like that, into a nourishing matter that some people call it dirt, but it's not quite dirt because it doesn't have all the things that dirt has in it, but it is a very good fertilizer for your gardens. Whenever I say grow my own compost, I make my own compost, and every season when I go to put in my fall garden bed, I take my own compost and throw it in my garden bed and mix it in with the soil, and that provides a lot of good nutrients to the soil as well. So the question often is how do I actually put something in the ground? And there are some key things that you want to keep in mind so that you have more luck with your actual plant. I'm going to use this again as an example. Oh, good, I've got this plant I can use also as an example. So let's say that this is my plant that I'm putting in the ground, and that it has, it's growing in, and this is the pot itself that it's growing in. So when we buy things from the store, they come in a pot already with dirt in it, right? We want to make sure that when we plant this into another container, that we are planting it at the same level that the plant material is coming out of the dirt. You don't want to bury this, and you don't want it to be too high, because a couple things will happen. If the root ball, which what we call that's in the pot is the root ball, if that is above the ground too much, it'll dry out. It'll act like a wick. And when the wind blows and the sun shines on it, it'll dry out, and it'll dry out all the way through that root ball. So that's going to be very stressful on your plant, and it could kill it. If you do too low, you run the risk. It's not always a given, but you run the risk of having some rot, because this has been hardened off at a certain area, and now you're burying it further than where it was hardened off. So you always want to put your plant at the same level in the container or in the garden bed at which it came out of the plant, the planter box, or we call it the nursery pot. Does that make sense? So you want to make sure that it's the same. And so one of the easiest ways to do that is to take your plant in the pot itself and kind of set it into the container and say, okay, if this pot is this big, my guess is that the soil is probably about an inch below the edge, roughly. You want to make sure that this doesn't go any deeper. You wouldn't want to put it way down here, because when you fill it up with soil, then you're going to be burying that plant up. So sometimes you can just fill your pot halfway and then set the pots, the nursery pots in there and say, oh, is this too high or is this too low? And then kind of move your soil in and out of the container based on that. Because once you take it out of the nursery pot and put it in the pot, you can move it again. You just don't want to stress it out by moving it too many times. I have done this mistake myself. I didn't judge well or whatever, and I will take it out and replant it lower or higher accordingly. So just make sure that you always put that plant in soil, and never too high or never too low. Always exactly like Goldilocks, right? Just right. When you're putting them into a pot, you can put multiple plants in one. So that's kind of nice about herbs. If you have a big container, you can put multiple herbs in one container. They can blend in together. You could throw a flower in there too, and you've got a lovely planter on your front porch or right by your kitchen door or on your back patio that's got your herbs and maybe a lovely flower in it. You can put them all together. They can be a little bit crowded, because what we're eating on these herbs, most of them, except for things like onions or garlic, right? We're eating the leaves. So we just want to make sure there's enough room in the pot for the roots to grow and spread out. And you want to make sure that everything's kind of tamped down. Don't press it down too hard. Don't press, and the reason you want to press down too hard is you press out all the air in the soil, and these roots need air to grow as well as water. And so if we make it too hard, then the water's not going to go through there easily, and those roots not getting the air it needs as well. If it's pot bound, and by pot bound I mean you pull it out of the little nursery pot and all you see is roots. There's no dirt seeing, it's all kind of white roots. That just means it's been in the pot for a long time at the store and you happen to pick that one, right? So